I'm Natalia Lobach, and this is Change Course. The Messy Middle. I am susceptible to this bias, and that is that we all think that once we've implemented change, once we've made that decision and that switch, we're done. Change is over. We're ready to move on. And nothing could be further from the truth. I got to thinking about this because of a recent change that we made in my family. And yeah, I was totally susceptible to this bias. I always forget that it's the post-change period that takes a little while to really make that change stick. And when you are changing processes and you're changing routines, and actually in that process of making change happen, it takes time and it takes investment and it feels really uncomfortable at first. That's why we call this, or at least I call this, the messy middle. And I see this bias all the time in workplaces and in change that I'm implementing at organizations. We all think, and a lot of leaders think, that we plan, we get our communications done, we train, we make sure everybody is ready for the change, and then once we hit day zero and we're in the new world, whether that's a new organizational structure, a new organization period, your new IT implementation going live. Yeah, day zero is really the beginning. And if we look at change from a holistic view, we're right in the middle. This is the messy middle. This is where it gets real, and this is where it gets hard. And this is the point at which change initiatives fail. This is the failure point. I've rarely seen failure happen in planning. I've rarely seen it happen in like that early run up to implementation. But when change has failed, it's happened at this point. And often I'm called in to help rehabilitate a change that's failed at the point of implementation. Because that experience is so negative for the stakeholders and the people involved, it can be a really tough road to walk if you're coming in after a failed change and trying again. So I'll tell you a little bit about the personal story and then how that relates to what we can do about it. So there have been a number of big changes for us as a family in 2023. My work has been speeding up quite a lot. I have a husband, his work is too. And we also have a child, and this child is in school and school's going great. But for many parents out there, you'll know, as I do on a daily basis, that school hours don't really line up with work hours. And as client expectations are rising, and as all of our work is getting busier again, which is great, at the same time, we also have a small child that we've got to take care of. And he's still quite young. And so this can prove to be quite difficult, especially when clients have expectations around when you're available. And so we decided to make a change where our son was entering into a program that does some education and childcare before the school day begins. And I don't know how I did it. And if I knew, I could make so many millions of dollars. But let me tell you, this was a fluke. I did not know that this is the way that it would turn out. So the funny thing is that somehow, some way, my son thought that it was his choice to go. He all of a sudden, out of the blue, started saying, I want to hang out with my friends more. I want to play with this particular child. And I was like, oh yeah, that's great. Okay. Yeah, but they're in the before school program. I was like, okay, well, maybe I could convince him to go. And previous to this year, it had been very negative. He didn't want to go, was not interested. And all of a sudden, he was begging me to go. And so somehow I managed to hit upon the what's in it for me and those benefits of change really early and easily with him. And so he almost made it easier for me. I had already been thinking about this for about a month. And then all of a sudden he came with this idea of I want to go. And so our needs and our desires aligned. And the change itself, the decision to change, wasn't the difficult part. So we started about a week ago, and of course, there are disruptions to routine. And we have to get up earlier. Like, he was already getting up fairly early, so it's just making that consistent. So we're getting up earlier, consistent time, and we're moving the routine up. So there's less leisure time in the morning, less time for exploratory play and other things. And we're moving very quickly on to moving towards getting out of the house. And I thought that for me, it would just be a simple transition. I'm moving this activity, I'm changing the time of this activity by 1 hour or an hour and a half. It's really not that big of a deal. But let me tell you, I was susceptible to the bias. I thought it would be just, like snap my fingers and I'd be done. And I was wrong. It took us about a week to get through that messy middle, the bedding down of the new routine, managing the expectations about what happens when we wake up in the morning. And, with a 6-year-old, it's interesting at times, but we made it through. But what I learned from this experience is that even with several decades of change under my belt, I was still susceptible to this bias. I still thought that I could get away with not going through the messy middle, and I was wrong. So for anyone who's going through this, give yourself the grace of the transition period. When we're talking about big organizational change, I always call this the messy middle because it helps people understand that we're actually in the middle of the change. Even though it feels like we're at the end, it's like day 0, we're done. We've changed. No, this is where we're changing routines, we're changing expectations, process. People are doing things differently. And as we all know, learning a new skill or doing something differently, there's a cognitive bias there. We want to do things the same way we've always done them. Humans are primed that way. And so it requires more mental energy. It requires discomfort to go through that. And so that messy middle period is the most intense period. That's where you're going to see more of the emotional responses to change happening. And this is where your team, who are your change leaders and maybe your change champions, are going to have the most burden on them. So how do we actually handle this or manage this? So a couple things around the expectations of time. In a large organizational change, you're looking at a period of anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks, sometimes more if it's a really complex change or if you're layering change upon change. So it could be 6 to 8 weeks, but you're not looking at anything less than 4. And this expectation is really important to manage right at the beginning. A lot of leaders will think, okay, you know what? It's going to be a week of pain and then it's going to be over. Yes and no. The first initial period is the hardest, but that period of adjustment, that 4 to 6 to maybe 8 weeks, is really where you're making that change solidify into the organization. So the tool that I like to use through this period is something that I've borrowed from Agile and Scrum. For those of you who come from software and IT, you'll know what this is. For those who are not really familiar, I'm sure you've heard those words everywhere. Everyone likes to talk about being agile. Everyone likes to talk about being, all this stuff, right? There's an actual methodology that goes along with it, and it's all about rapid development and release of ideas or products or improvements. And so what a agile process or a scrum process allows you to do is actually speed up innovation and speed up testing and delivery of those innovations to your stakeholders, to your consumers. So you might not be familiar with how this process works, but you definitely have experienced this process. So for example, I'm assuming everybody at this point has a computer in their pocket. You've got a smartphone, and you'll know that when there are software releases, they often come sort of successively one after the other. And the first release is always buggy. There's always problems with it. And typically you'll see another release within another couple of weeks to resolve those issues. The purpose of the first release is not to be perfect. It's to release functionality as quickly and efficiently as possible. The point is to find those issues and then work them through in successive releases. And so the idea is that you're improving towards where you want to be, but you're also prioritizing what is most important to the community that you're serving. So expect that when you get the first release, there's going to be problems and they'll be resolved fairly quickly. It's part of the process. The thing that I like to borrow from this methodology is the team interaction, the human interaction piece. So in an agile or scrum process, you have the huddle, and the huddle is focused on identifying and solving problems. The huddle is where you bring the issues that you found in the software release that have maybe been raised by consumers or you found yourself through testing, and you identify them for the group, and the group helps to identify what solutions might be available for that and also identifies who's working on it. And then you bring that back to the group each time you do the huddle. On day 0 of your change, this is where you're going to see a ton of challenges, issues, problems come up right away within that first critical week. So the best thing to do is to bring your implementation team together. I consider this the sponsor, the leads, and your champions. And at the beginning of this period, you're usually looking at twice a day, and they're going to be quite long and they're going to be quite intense. But as you go through that 6 or 8 week period, you'll see that the problems start to diminish, the solutions start to get faster, your team gets better at managing it, and soon you'll be able to decide to stop them altogether because you no longer need it. The change has now been implemented, the change is solid, it's working, and you no longer need to meet twice a day or once a day to discuss problems, because now there's another way to deal with that. Typically, after this point, you transition into operations or regular process. And there are other ways to raise or deal with issues through an operational process. So typically when I am working through this with a client in some software implementations or IT implementations, we call this the hypercare period. And that's exactly what it sounds like. You're putting extra attention and extra focus on ensuring that the solution is working. In change implementations, you can call it hypercare. I typically call this the transform phase. So in connected change, we have our 4-phase change implementation model. This is the transform phase. This is where we spend the most amount of time. This is where the most of our effort goes. And what I find interesting too is that this is where the highest emotional burden is on your implementation team. They're hearing a lot of negative feedback. They might be receiving that negative feedback directly to them. And this can be really hard to work through. But what I find with the huddle process is that you will see some of the same issues being brought up, or you'll hear similar things that are happening inside the organization from your teammates. And you'll be able to commiserate and talk through it and identify solutions together. In the past, we typically tried to do this in isolation, and a lot of other change methodologies don't even talk about this part. They don't even really address it. They talk about resistance and they talk about implementation and what you're doing, but they don't really talk about how to keep your team functioning at a really high level. And to me, this is the key. You've really got to be focusing on how are you ensuring that the solutions that you are coming up with are not customized or individualized. If you do that, then what you're going to see is a lot of workarounds, a lot of rejecting change in ways that end up being very customized or convoluted for specific teams or groups of people. And if you deal with it on an individual basis, that's what's going to happen. What you have to do is look at it from a holistic view and work through it as a team and as an organization. And that way, you're going to be able to, over time, as you're putting this attention into the messy middle, into that discomfort, into working through those negative emotions and all of that churn that comes up from the organization, naturally resisting a change, but really trying hard to get to the other side. This is how you're going to be successful, by carrying that change through that 4 to 6 week critical period after day 0. And then you can move on into where this change is becoming accepted. It's not as challenged, and people are beginning to see the benefits of change showing up for them. So I'm sure that you have encountered this bias as well, and maybe you're susceptible to it like I am. But yes, the messy middle is real. And if you're in the messy middle, I wish you the best of luck as you work through the implementation of your change. Thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, I invite you to like, share, rate, and subscribe because it helps others find us. Change Course is brought to you by Charthouse Advisory Services and ConnectedChange.com. Our music is Levity by Emily Clausen. Show notes have moved. We're now at ConnectedChange.com. So visit us there under the Change Course podcast page, and you'll find a list of all the resources that I've mentioned here today. While you're visiting us, sign up for the Change Navigator newsletter. You'll keep on top of all things change, and every month we are sharing exclusive content and resources only with our subscribers. So don't miss out. Sign up at ConnectedChange.com. Thank you for listening, and remember, it's never too late to change course. What drives you?